Happy Sunday, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. And hopefully you saw from the title of this particular musing that it is rated PG-13. So I know some of you listen to these with your kids or have your kids separately listen to them because you told me as much. And so depending on the age of your kids, you may want to, withhold this one or listen to it first and decide what you want to do. But just giving you that fair warning, because we will be talking about some interesting, I don't know what you call it, interesting things around sexual relations and what LDS church leaders have said about it. And if that makes you squeamish or you're bored by that or not interested, the broader point I'm going to make at the end is a doctrinal one. There's more to this issue than what meets the eye. What meets the eye here is oh my gosh, we're talking about sex, but there's actually something more substantive that I think is a significant challenge that we as a church deal with. So if you need to, bear with me through the sex talk. And stick around for the end, where we'll talk about the broader implications of this and what it means for us as church members. So our story begins in 1982. In January, the First Presidency of the church, top leadership, sends a letter to all of the local leaders. So this is stake presidents, mission presidents, district presidents, bishops, and branch presidents. Not uncommon. These local leaders get letters all the time instructing them in various things. It's how the First Presidency kind of communicates policy and new changes to the local leaders, who are kind of the boots on the ground in implementing this stuff. So in January of 1982, the First Presidency sent a letter out, and the purpose of this letter was to clarify standards around worthiness interviews for temple recommends. As a fun little aside, I think I've mentioned this before, but they've changed the wording of the temple recommend interviews. I'm about to go get mine renewed next week, and they used to say, what was it? Do you affiliate with any group that has any practices or beliefs that are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ, or something like that, right? Do you affiliate with any groups? And it was born out of kind of the whole polygamy thing, when they were trying to shut down polygamy and kill off the fringe, sects, the fundamentalists, and root them out. That's where that question was born from. And they've since dropped it, or kind of like massaged it so it's not as stark. But whenever I get my temple recommend interview and they ask me that question, I'd always say, yeah, I'm a member of the Republican Party. And it was always fun to see the reaction of the counselor, whoever I'm interviewing, either at the ward or the stake level. Because, living in Utah, especially in Lehigh in Utah County, basically all of them always were also Republican. And so sometimes I'd get an eye roll, sometimes I'd just get a chuckle, and then they'd move on. Anyway, so this question, or this whole letter, January 1982, centers around worthiness interview for temple recommends for prospective missionaries, but for members of the church in general. I'm going to read a portion of this letter. It's a 2-page letter, and it was signed by President Kimball, who at the time was kind of incapacitated and not really running the show too much, and Eldon Tanner, who died later that year, Marion G. Romney, and then Gordon B. Hinckley. This is one of the rare instances in which there were actually 3 counselors in the First Presidency, including the president. So 4 people. The last time it had happened was during David O. McKay's presidency. He had extra counselors, but before that, it was all the way back to Brigham Young. So fairly rare to have an additional counselor, like when they added Gordon B. Hinckley. I suspect that's likely because of the health challenges of Kimball and Tanner. And so throughout the year, it was actually Hinckley running much of the show and doing the public affairs for the First Presidency, because his colleagues were kind of old. Okay, here's the paragraph. Again, this is in context of a temple recommend interview, clarification, or instruction for local leaders. The letter says, in interviewing one for a temple recommend, the individual being interviewed should be reminded that the Lord has said no unclean thing should enter his house, the temple. The procedure should be the same as for other interviews. When interviewing married persons, the one doing the interviewing should scrupulously avoid indelicate inquiries, which may be offensive to the sensibilities of those being interviewed. Married persons should understand that if in their marital relations they are guilty of unnatural, impure, or unholy practices, they should not enter the temple unless and until they repent and discontinue any such practices. Husbands and wives who are aware of these requirements can determine by themselves their standing before the Lord. All of this should be conveyed without having priesthood leaders focus upon intimate matters which are part of husband and wife relationships. Skillful interviewing and counseling can occur without discussion of clinical details by placing firm responsibility on individual members of the church to put their lives in order before exercising the privilege of entering a house of the Lord. I'm gonna pause there. There's a little bit more I'll share in just a second. But before I get there, it's interesting to note that that paragraph that I just read makes very clear that the burden of interpretation is on the individual, that it's up to husband and wife to determine what happens, that leaders should not pry, they shouldn't discuss details, but it's up to them to interpret whether any of their sexual acts are, quote, unnatural, impure, or unholy. Okay, right? You might say, great, we get to decide for ourselves. However, the paragraph concludes with this. The First Presidency has interpreted oral sex as constituting an unnatural, impure, or unholy practice. If a person is engaged in a practice which troubles him enough to ask about it, he should discontinue it. So broadly speaking, it's like, hey, don't do anything unnatural, impure, or unholy, but that's up to you to decide what that means, with the exception of oral sex, which the First Presidency is defining as unnatural, impure, and unholy. So they are went the step in 1982 of saying, here's a line in the sand. Everything else you get to interpret, but oral sex has to be off the list. Now, by way of clarification, this letter was never intended to be read over the pulpit. This is just counsel for church leaders and not church members. It was meant for training purposes, right? Nonetheless, it was clear policy set by the First Presidency. Of course, maybe you're thinking, as I was when I first encountered this, why just oral sex? Why not? This feels really weird to talk about in a public video, but why not? Other other forms of intercourse that some might deem unnatural, awkward. Okay, so, well, or even something silly like sticking your tongue in your spouse's ear, if that turns them on. I mean, that's not natural. The tongue doesn't belong in the ear. So how is one to define, more broadly speaking, what unnatural means, or impure, or unholy? And why did the First Presidency feel to single out oral sex specifically? So a few months goes by. This was January, right? A few months goes by, and the First Presidency starts getting a number of letters. And a lot of local leaders and members were kind of expressing concerns about that letter. And they were grappling with it, and there were problems. So the First Presidency had to chose to issue 9 months later a follow-up letter. So that first letter was January 1982. Now we're on October 15th, 1982. They send a letter to the same list of local leaders, and I am going to read the 3 paragraphs that are in that letter. Same First Presidency. N. Eldon Tanner dies 1 month after this letter, a few weeks. Again, Kimball's kind of incapacitated from kind of public efforts, but it's the same 4 people signing the letter, and here's what it says. Under date of January 5th, 1982, we addressed a letter to you which outlined procedures to be followed in conducting worthiness interviews. Since then, we have received a number of letters from members of the church which indicate clearly that some local leaders have been delving into private, sensitive matters beyond the scope of what is appropriate. In conducting worthiness interviews, you should follow carefully the instructions contained in our letter of January 5th, 1982. Also, you should never inquire into personal, intimate matters involving marital relations between a man and his wife. You should never deviate from or go beyond the specific questions contained in the Temple Recommend book. If, in the course of such interviews, a member asks questions about the propriety of specific conduct, you should not pursue the matter, but should merely suggest that if the member has enough anxiety about the propriety of the conduct to ask about it, the best course would be to discontinue it. We feel, brethren, that if those who conduct these interviews are sensitive and wise, they can avoid such explicit questions being asked by those being interviewed. Final paragraph. We request that stake presidents and mission presidents make certain that those under their jurisdiction who are authorized to conduct worthiness interviews are properly constructed about this matter. Also, when new brethren are called to offices which include the authority to conduct worthiness interviews, stake presidents and mission presidents should make sure that these new appointees are properly instructed in the same way. Okay, so that is the October letter. What's interesting about it is it reaffirms part of the January letter, in which they basically said, this is up to interpretation between husband and wife, and you should not pry. And you should be cautious in your interviewing and your counseling to not get into what they called clinical details. So the October letter is basically saying, hey, there's some of you bishops and others who are taking license to pry, to inquire, to discuss sensitive matters of what happens in a husband and wife's bedroom. It also reaffirmed a portion of the letter that said, let's see, if a person, so in the first letter it says, if a person is engaged in a practice which troubles him enough to ask about it, he should discontinue it. And then, of course, that is reaffirmed in the October letter, where it says, if to leaders, it's saying, hey, if a member asks you about any specific conduct, that they have some anxiety about that conduct, then you should advise them to discontinue it. So if you've got a church member who's like, oh, is it okay to, fill in the blank sexual fantasy or sexual position or sexual whatever with my wife or with my husband? The position both in January and in October of 1982, both of these letters is, if you don't feel right about it, then you shouldn't do it. Okay, so what's interesting is yes, the October 1982 letter reaffirmed those two things, right? Leaders not prying into sensitive husband-wife relationships and counseling members to avoid sexual conduct that they feel uneasy or anxious or curious about. The October letter, however, was silent on the matter of the First Presidency defining oral sex as an unholy, impure, or unnatural practice. This letter was not a retraction of that by any means. It was not a walking back. It was not a clarification. If anything, all it was, hey, we've taken this position. Just don't ask, don't tell, right? Just don't inquire about it. This is still the position, though. And if anyone asks you about it, you're welcome to tell them, or you should tell them, the position of the First Presidency, right? And this is the interpretation, but don't pry beyond that. Of course, several years after that is when they changed the instructions for issuing a temple recommend to simply inquire about, do you live the law of chastity? And again, leaving it up to church members themselves to define, much like the word of wisdom or are you a full tithe payer, both of which I've done musings about. And so if you have not listened to the word of wisdom musing or the tithing musing, we as a church, I believe, get both of these completely wrong, and chances are you might as well. So you can head to sundaymusings.org to find that little filter drop down so you can search by topic. Okay, then in 1999, we get the Limited Use Temple Recommend book, or I should say that book printed in 1999 was later leaked years later so the public could see what was in it. And in that letter, these are the instructions for the leaders conducting the interview. It tells them to exercise great care when interviewing applicants for recommends to enter a temple. Be sure that they understand this is the Lord's house. No one unworthy should enter. An applicant who isn't living up to church standards and principles has to demonstrate that they've repented before they can receive a recommend. When interviewing an applicant for a recommend, do not inquire into personal, intimate matters about marital relations between a husband and wife. Generally, do not deviate from the recommend interview questions. If during an interview an applicant asks about the propriety of specific conduct, do not pursue the matter. Merely suggest that if the applicant has enough anxiety about the propriety of the conduct, blah, 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 right? So that's kind of repeating October 1982, a decade and a half prior, that portion of the First Presidency letter. Okay, one more aspect to this, and then we'll get into the broader doctrinal question at issue here. So the next update is from the handbook. The handbook, since this letter in 1982 has been updated 6 or 7 times that I could figure out, and none of them repeated the First Presidency's interpretation on oral sex. It did mention, don't do anything unholy or impure or unnatural, but the handbook itself was not so explicit to contain that interpretation by the First Presidency. And previously in the handbook, I should say the latest version before this current update, so the last version, and I think this section was in there in whole or in part for some time. Previously it said that the Lord's law of chastity is abstinence from sexual relations outside of lawful marriage and fidelity within marriage. Sexual relations are proper only between a man and woman who are legally and lawfully wedded as husband and wife. I intend to do a musing at some point about how I think the church should not tie its standard of sexual relations and marriage to Caesar's definition of marriage. For the church to say that you have to first be legally and lawfully wedded, I think contains potentially some problems. Right? First you go to the government and get a permission slip, and then you go to God and the church. I think people should be able to just, go to God and the church and, form a union. And if they desire the tax benefits or the contractual benefits or the inheritance benefits of getting their, private marriage recognized by the state, then, go ahead. Anyways, save that for later. But here in the manual, in the handbook, it's saying you have to be legally and lawfully wedded as husband and wife. Adultery, fornication, homosexual or lesbian relations, and every other unholy, unnatural, or impure practice are sinful. Members who violate the Lord's law of chastity or who influence others to do so are subject to church discipline. So if we go back to that 1982 letter where the First Presidency explicitly said that oral sex is an unnatural, unholy, and impure practice, here in the handbook, the church was saying that such unholy, unnatural, or impure practices are sinful. We could have inferred that on our own, because if you're doing something unholy or impure, then, that's analogous to sin. Unnatural, again, is a question mark. If I, if I do something that someone considers unnatural, is it unnatural, and how do you define that? But here they're saying these things are sinful. Now in the church's handbook, there's an update and you might say a simplification. So now it just says the Lord's law of chastity is abstinence from sexual relations outside of a legal marriage between a man and a woman, and fidelity within marriage. Physical intimacy between husband and wife is intended to be beautiful and sacred. That's a new sentence. Thumbs up. It is ordained of God for the creation of children and for the expression of love between husband and wife. That's important because in past decades and generations, there were many members of the church who felt that intimacy was only for the creation of children, and that you shouldn't, have sex unless you're intending to or trying to, procreate. But here it's saying in the handbook, it's for making babies, and it's also to express love between husband and wife. And then it continues. Only a man and a woman who are legally and lawfully wedded as husband and wife should have sexual relations. In God's sight, moral cleanliness is very important. Violations of the law of chastity are very serious. Those involved misuse the sacred power God has given to create life. Goes on then to talk about particular cases for discipline, like if you're having an extramarital affair or homosexual relations or things like that, if you're using the sexual gift outside of its intended purposes. So interesting two things there. One is the addition of, the positive aspects of this, because oftentimes the handbook is like, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. And here's this positive affirmation that, sex is intended to be beautiful and sacred. And that it's not just for making babies, but it's to express love, in a husband-wife relationship. So there's some positive things put in. And then they omit in the new handbook this concept of every other unholy, unnatural, or impure practice. So gone are the references in the section dealing with, the Lord's law of chastity and husband-wife relations. Okay, so listening to all this, maybe it's curious, maybe it's interesting, maybe you've never heard of this before. Chances are you haven't. So now we've got to, come to terms with the fact that at one point, 41 years ago, the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints declared effectively to the world that oral sex is a sin. So what? Well, in my mind, the broader concern here question is whether it remains binding and authoritative. I feel like, so the issue here isn't even for me about oral sex or sex in general. It's another instance in which there is a lack of clarity about what is official and binding and authoritative and from God. And I feel like we as a church kind of suck at this. We don't really have a good handle on when something is doctrine and when it is policy and when it's binding, and when something that was said 41 years ago but has not been said since, when that 41-year-old statement continues to apply or not. Do we need modern church leaders to reaffirm and repeat everything in each new presidency and each new generation so that we know that these things are still binding? I think that's kind of silly. We can't expect them to have to regurgitate things just so we know that, we still mean it. But if they don't, and we've got stuff on the books from long ago, either way long ago, getting into, blood atonement and all kinds of stuff in the past, or more recently, where you have the top leaders of the church, men whom we sustain as prophets, seers, and revelators, people who we consider as expressing the will of God, when they say something in unity like this, the four of them as a First Presidency, and there's no clarification or retraction afterwards, does it still apply or not? Right? If it was conclusively a sin in 1982, then was it 1984? Do we wait 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? At what point, is it a sin or not? I mean, that's a pretty bold thing to say, this is sinful conduct. It would imply, in my mind, since God is an ever-changing God, one of two things. Either, number one, the First Presidency was wrong and God doesn't consider it a sin, and so we should discard and ignore their statement despite it being official and authoritative and right from the top of the church and all the things. So that's number one. Or number two, they were right and it is sinful, and successive church leaders have not spoken about it for whatever reason. Maybe they feel that, it's already been said, so now that's binding and we don't need to reinforce it. Those with ears to hear, let them hear, right? Or, the Lord has instructed us not to, or modern culture is such that we're, not really inclined to wade into such things anymore. right? It's messy. It's murky. Who knows? I mean, I have my suspicions. But again, this issue goes beyond just a 1982 statement on oral sex. This is something we as a church really need to work through and get a handle on, because there is a broad, profound lack of clarity on many issues like this when time passes and maybe society changes, maybe our understanding changes, maybe new insights or revelation comes in or whatever. And so you look at that past thing, whatever it was, and you're like, that was not right. But then if you were a member in 1982 and you're a bishop and you get this letter, could you have said it's not right? Oh, yeah, that's not right. Right? No, that's not our church culture. It's like you obey what's coming, but then with time, there's a little bit more separation, so you can say, that wasn't right. But at the time, you're branded as an apostate or whatever if you don't fall in line behind the explicit counsel of what's coming from the top. So we don't really have a good mechanism by which to evaluate these types of things. And I feel like because we lack that, it creates, certainly a lack of clarity, some confusion, but also frustration. I talked with a lot of members of the church who have a hard time processing some of these things. And they feel like they go to extreme interpretations very easily. Oh, church isn't true. Or, oh, they're all making it up. Oh, they're... whatever. And they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. They shed nuance. They just, rush to conclusion. And that's sad, because I don't think the extremes hold the answers in these cases. But if we don't work through this lack of clarity, if we don't have a better way to understand what's true and what's divine and what's authoritative, I feel like this kind of spiritual corruption and carnage is just going to continue, because members of the church with increasing time are going to look back on past things and be like, well, that wasn't right, and that wasn't right, and what does that mean about the leaders today? And should I not assume and accept that everything is automatically right? So this isn't obviously a new kind of concern or question. In 2007, in May, the church put out a press release where they announced to everybody, the world, what is doctrine and what is not. And they said, not every statement made by a church leader, past or present, necessarily constitutes doctrine. A single statement made by a single leader on a single occasion often represents a personal, though well-considered opinion, but is not meant to be officially binding for the whole church. With divine inspiration, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 counsel together to establish doctrine that is consistently proclaimed in official church publications. This doctrine resides on the four standard works of Scripture, official declarations and proclamations, articles of faith. Isolated statements are often taken out of context, leaving their original meaning distorted. Okay. So, this is in response to, you get leaders of the church who will be at some like regional conference or state conference, and they'll say something and it spreads like wildfire, and because they'll speak off the cuff rather than the carefully curated messages at general conference. And so the church over the years has been like, we gotta clarify that, when elder so-and-so is off yonder talking about things, like that's not necessarily doctrine. Okay, reasonable enough. Individual, one-off statements, not doctrine. And yet here it talks about, the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 together established doctrine. What it doesn't say is, what if it's just the First Presidency? Because in this case, these letters were from the First Presidency, the four of them. It was in an official church publication, as it also says it's required here. Don't know if the Quorum of the 12 was involved, notified, aware, anything like that. But to me, it seems like the letters coming from the First Presidency would have a leg up, certainly, on any one leader of the church randomly saying, I think oral sex is a sin. That would be easy to kind of set aside, right? Okay, uncle, or whatever, right? Like, thanks for your opinion. Love ya. Okay, it would be easy to kind of set aside the opinions of one person that you feel are like, I don't agree with that, or I don't think that's necessarily, revelatory and divine. But when it comes from the First Presidency, that, of course, elevates it a bit and puts it in a different light. This is further, perhaps, exacerbated or accentuated or whatever by the fact that in the temple, covenants are made we make covenants to avoid unholy and impure practices. Like part of what we do in the temple is being very clear about saying we are trying to rise above. We are trying to live, at a higher level. We're trying to shed these sinful practices. And so what are we covenanting to actually to do? If we don't understand what an unholy or impure practice is, of course, the temple covenant doesn't contain the word unnatural, as I recall. But what are we actually covenanting to do? Because if there's a lack of clarity about what is or is not natural or holy or pure, are we violating our covenants if we're getting frisky in the bedroom in a way that some church leaders might deem to be unholy or unnatural? So I think the January letter was fine in just saying, hey, don't pry. It's between husband and wife. We shouldn't have unholy behavior that prevents us from going to the temple and being in God's house. This is up to you to evaluate. That would be copacetic. It's the fact that they went a step further and made a very clear line in the sand determination without any follow-up or revocation. So in modern parlance of church culture, it's still binding. It's still authoritative. It's never been revoked. No church leaders ever said, oh, psych, that's not true. And this happens a lot with past church doctrine things where beliefs and practices have kind of evolved, but we just don't say anything about it. You kind of sweep the history under the rug and just say, this is what we're doing now. And I think there's danger when people learn that history and they're like, what the heck? The church has changed. I thought God was unchanging. And then they go to the extremes and say either that modern church leaders are corrupt or that the old church leaders were corrupt. And then they just, leave the church or go to some type of extreme thing. So, it's ultimately to me not about the sex aspect of this. Like me personally, I land on the side of saying that interpretation is not from God, that it's not sinful. You may disagree with that. That's fine. And under the January letter, we can each have our own interpretations, even though the First Presidency determined that, but without any type of clarification or whatever. And because also rationally it doesn't make sense to me why oral sex would be a sin, but everything else you can do in the bedroom with your spouse is not a sin. That doesn't intuitively make sense. All that it makes me think of is that the First Presidency, these very elderly gentlemen at the time, had been hearing about or already understood this idea of oral sex, but they didn't really know about other sexual positions and activities and things, and therefore didn't think to include them. So maybe if a modern statement were to come out, they would have an addendum and say, oh, all these other 18 things are also unnatural and impure and unholy. So maybe we should be grateful that there's been no reiteration or whatever. I don't know. But to me, it's more a curiosity of here we go again. Here's another instance in which this thing was said a long time ago from a very authoritative source and not just a single one-off church leader. Is it binding or is it not? And because as a church, we don't really have any clear guidelines to go by, and because there are a number of instances in which things that were formerly taught have been often quietly, but sometimes explicitly repudiated. Think blacks in the priesthood or polygamy or whatever. Sometimes it's oh, we're changing this. And other times it's just this kind of quiet, change over time. But we don't really have a good framework on how to navigate that. And so some navigate it okay. Many navigate it with a lot of challenge and difficulty. And I think that's sad. I think we would all benefit from some type of framework or better determination. Obviously, you don't want to get so explicit that anything that has not been reiterated in the past, 30 years shall no longer be considered doctrine. And so then the church has to start keeping track of okay, have we, when was the last time in general conference someone talked about, I don't know, doing initiatories, for the dead or whatever, right? You don't want to keep track of every little doctrinal thing and then how often it's been said so that it doesn't fall into the framework and get discarded as doctrine. You don't want to go there for obvious reasons. But the pendulum is entirely on the other side, where there is no framework and there is no guidance, and there's just assumptions, and there's this idea that, well, anything that hasn't been superseded remains binding, but it basically infers that everything that's always been taught is right. But if we don't practice it anymore, if we don't do it anymore, then was it and is it? I don't know. These are interesting questions. And that's all I got. I'm at the cabin, heading home now. Got a fun week of a lot of stuff ahead. Hope you guys are doing well. Remember, sundaymusings.org if you want to catch up on any past episodes. Feel free to share this with a friend if you know others struggling with their faith or curious about things or, that would benefit from it. I always appreciate when you guys share with others. And leave a review on your favorite podcast app. That's always nice too. Ooh, hummingbird. Lots of hummingbirds around here. We have a little feeder outside. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week.